Hello to everyone. Thank you so much for the interest in our session, so I'm happy to be here. First of all, I would like to thank you, Extreme Hangout, for this beautiful room and for the co-hosting with us the session, and also to the Training Center of the State Tax Services of Azerbaijan, who was the also co-host and the author of the idea. Thank you, Sarhan, who's the head of the Sarhan Hashimov, who is the head of the Training Center. Thank you for the brilliant idea. Before I would call for the panelists, for the esteemed panelists today that will contribute to the event, I just wanted to give some background and context to today's event. So the topic is the role of the tax policy in a just transition. So nowadays, we understand that, okay, we have commitments, we have very ambitious commitments with the energy transition, with the reduction of the emissions. But the question is the businesses, SMEs, are ready to this transition? What the challenges are standing in front of them? And what the tax policy can do around this? So what is the role of the tax policy? Actually, when we were thinking about the topic of the joint event, we were thinking around carbon pricing or CBAM adjustment or the reporting. But then so I saw like what was the actual inspiration for the topic. It was actually the PwC reports, recently published reports on the enabling and delivering just transition. Both of the reports are addressing important questions of the what is expected from the tax policy from the governments around this. And during these days, during the COP, I was in a number of sessions, and almost in all the panel, it was a question from the audience. Okay, what is the government role? What is the measures? What are the incentives? So that gave me some sort of the assurance that the topic is relevant. On this note, I would like to call to our speakers to invite them. First speaker is Samir Mamedov, who is the General Manager of UN Global Compact in Azerbaijan. Thank you. Yeah. And we can sit, I think. Let's make it more informal. Farid Isayev, who is the advisor to the head of the State Tax Services of Azerbaijan. And Emin İlyas, who is the founder and director of Bi-European LLC. Yeah. How to start the discussion. Actually, before going directly into the tax policies, I wanted to ask Samir, you to give us the definition and what you understand for what is the just transition. And most of us must probably know it was like many times discussed during the COP already. But when we have chat with you, we came to a conclusion that there is a number of just transition definitions and there is a number of perspectives how to look into it. So maybe you can share some thoughts with our audience.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Hopefully you'll walk away from this session feeling it was worth your time. I think what Gunela really means is that, for being incapable of speaking credibly about taxes, I'll get to speak about just transition and a connection to taxes. I'll try to connect it to sort of everyday practice as much as possible. What just transition refers to is basically a way to transition to greener economies and greener industries without leaving anyone behind. In other words, so that the burden of this transition, as well as their benefits, are distributed proportionally between, and I think that's the important part. That is the part that that's being underlooked, between jurisdictions, countries, communities, industries, workers. So it's not just between the countries, right? So in the geopolitical context, the examples would be, say, small island countries, right, who contributed least to the problem, right, but are struggling most from the consequences. Another one is obviously oil and gas, right? As an industry, the just transition would be that as we transition to green energy, what happens to the industry? What happens to the workforce within the industry? Do they become obsolete, or are they upskilled and reskilled? Right. So when we talk about just transition, it is not only between countries. Yeah. So the justice is not there. It's in multiple domains. I think the best I was thinking about it. What is the quickest relationship between just transition and, say, taxation? And I think it becomes most comprehensible when we draw a parallel with sustainability in the private sector, right? So if we started off, if the starting point was, for the private sector, the message was that there is a shareholder value that is comprised primarily of profitability and a bottom line. We then said, look, no, there's that, but there's also sustainability. So there was shareholder value and sustainability, and now the pitch has changed. Now we're saying that sustainability is part of the shareholder proposition, is part of the shareholder value that we're offering. What we actually mean is that sustainability, corporate sustainability, has to absolutely make operational and commercial sense for the private sector. Without that, sustainability in itself is not going to be sustainable. I will always have a job done, which I hope is not the case. Not only to motivate the private sector, but to transition sustainability, move to sustainability, obviously requires investments, requires expenditures. In the case of private sector, it's revenues and profit to, say, change your fleet of internal combustion vehicles to electric vehicles, or to train and retrain your workforce. So the source here is commercial revenues, but it's very, very similar when it comes to the governments, right? We're talking about NDCs, but leave NDCs aside for a second. For a country to become greener in itself, it requires funding. And almost homogeneously, still the biggest part and most significant part of a country's revenues come from are public revenues, taxation basically. So if the country doesn't have the funds to support the transition that derives from taxation, we will continue from a COP to COP saying, okay, what we said until now was theoretical. At the next COP will be more specific in terms of the numeric commitments, right? So when I was invited to this panel, it was not clear for me, but it becomes more clear as I think about this, is that there's a very direct interlink between taxation and just transition, right? Countries have to be able to afford the investments that just transition requires. And from what we're seeing from the context of COP, this is an expensive business. An expensive business is fine as long as we look at it as an investment. For us to look at it as an investment, we don't only look at, obviously, on the cost side of it, but we also need to be looking into revenue side of this, which is still, by a larger chunk, is public revenues and taxation. Did that make sense?
You stole my job. Yeah, actually that was very good. Like the example and the thoughts on how to connect it with each other was the role of the tax policy. So generally the just transition recognized the social impact of the transition to the low carbon economy. And the questions that were raised by the panelists, by the audience, was always like, okay, but who should pay for that? Or let's say, if you, as a big company or as a big country, developed country, decided to transit, what should I do as a small country? What should I do as a small entity? And So it's clear that the most affected is the workforce, it's in supply chain, it's SMEs, it's the vulnerable, like social communities.
Industries.
Industries, yes, sometimes even countries if we take like macroeconomically. And here, right now, at this moment, let's say the most efficient way that right now the governments are discussing
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well. First of all, I want to thank the host for having me and our audience actually for joining this discussion. I believe that carbon pricing is a very important topic, and this is already demonstrated during this COP. A few sessions have been dedicated to this topic. In fact, one was organized earlier today by the State Tax Service, but also earlier this week, which was attended by one head of state from European countries. So this shows that carbon pricing generates a lot of interest from private sector, from public sector, and generally the impact it may have, by the way, both positive and maybe negative, it needs to be assessed and analyzed with greater detail. So we, of course, in Azerbaijan and as part of State Tax Service, we're studying this topic. We have experts who are analyzing international best practices. We speak to other tax administrations, including those who are members of IOTA, which is Intra-European Organization of Tax Administrations. For your information, State Tax Service in this year presently have the role of president of IOTA. So we are driving this topic also as part of our role within IOTA. And we organized a forum in Baku this September. It was an international forum where we try to analyze different aspects of carbon pricing. So this is the stage where we are in. Also, carbon pricing, of course, becomes very relevant from the climate commitments that each country has. And of course, Azerbaijan has NDCs which are currently in force, but also working on the third generation of NDCs, which stands for National Determined Contributions. So carbon pricing generally is very closely linked to that. In fact, according to UNFCCC, 2/3 of countries who have submitted NDCs as part of their Paris commitments also link NDCs to carbon pricing instruments in their country as means of funding this climate action. Of course, carbon pricing is a topic that needs to be adapted to a particular jurisdiction and the context. And of course, there are a number of instruments to choose from. Maybe the most classic one would be the carbon tax, and this is usually the one which is administered and proposed by the tax administration. However, there's another quite popular choice, which is the ETS, standing for Emission Trading System. ETS operates on the principle of cap and trade. So this is usually interesting for private sector because they know if they're below the cap, they can trade the allowance that they have, and this way commercialize their operations in the segment of decarbonization. Carbon tax, of course, is more understandable as means of a classic tax tool, even though there are also possibilities of designing it around fuel-based approach or direct emissions approach, because we understand that the whole agenda on decarbonization, it focuses on reducing the emissions. So direct emissions approach in this way, of course, is more favorable, but it also requires a lot of investment and expertise from the government to have the relevant technical tools in place such as MRV, which stands for measurement, reporting and verification. Or the fuel-based approach, of course, is very similar to what you would have as a excise on fuel tax, and many countries have these excise duties on fuel, including Azerbaijan, by the way. So to sum up, I would say that we need to look at what we regard as explicit carbon pricing instrument and implicit, because we already have instruments which one may regard as implicit carbon pricing instruments, so-called environmental taxes. So I'll give you a few examples of that. So we have excise on fuel, we have mining tax, we have road tax for foreign vehicles, for example. We also have not very conventional tax tools, but nevertheless you may regard them as being environmental levies. So we have energy efficiency levies, which shall go to the energy efficiency fund. We also have utilization charge, which was introduced fairly recently on the older vehicles which are imported into the country. So all these measures you may regard again as being in place and somewhat covering already environmental taxation. But of course, explicit taxes would be, as we discussed earlier, things like carbon tax or ETS. Or there's actually a third stream, which is, I think, very interesting. And in fact, COP29, one of the early accomplishments, already right on the first day was announced the progress made on Article 6.4, which set out the basic rules and principles for the operation of Article 6.4. So this is basically UN-regulated carbon markets. So carbon crediting system, again, is another way that you may consider in the context of carbon pricing, because if you approach it in the right way, actually your carbon credits can become your tax assets, not your tax liabilities. So there are, again, interlinks between these two matters.
Thank you, Farid. It's actually a very detailed and comprehensive explanation of the possible options. It seems that, so generally to some extent, Azerbaijan has already some sort of the carbon taxes, but we are thinking further about what to do as the next steps. There is if I refer to the reports of PwC that on the enabling just transition, there is a statistic, actually, it's an also statistic of the, it's based on the UK market. It's around 5 to 8% of the weekly expenditures of the households relates to the carbon taxes. So the carbon taxes, at the end of the day, they become the burden for the consumers, the consumer tax. And considering this, the more, let's say, low-income households may be resistant to accept this, or they may be not welcoming from them. And actually, the aim of the carbon tax is generally change the habits of the consumptions. And here's what might be the right instruments, let's say, to change the habits or to promote the low carbon economy. And for example, what type of the measures we have right now in Azerbaijan in this context?
Thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Discussing and sharing experience with our partners from multilateral development banks, also tax administrations, or generally academia consultants, we come to the conclusion that very few countries actually managed to introduce carbon pricing smoothly. So in many cases, more often than not, there would be a resistance or maybe some kind of displeasure from population, but businesses alike to these measures, because, as you mentioned, so this initially comes as an additional cost which wasn't envisaged in the prior periods. So the businesses, when they have to assume this additional burden, their natural reaction would be to pass on this cost to the consumers. And this is what generates dissatisfaction with these measures. Of course, there are some exceptions. Again, for example, environmentalists, they would welcome such a move. But generally, again, we speak about the things that you may expect when you introduce a measure of this nature. But the good news is that carbon pricing generally and carbon tax in particular, it has been already implemented in many countries many years ago. So we have some kind of track record to compare and to learn from past mistakes, and maybe to see where could be the possible risk areas. So going to your question, what can be done maybe to minimize this resistance, or at least to demonstrate that there is actually a longer-term strategy behind this type of measure. There are a few recommendations that we hear, and I think some of them are really common sense type of recommendations. So if you are going to apply this cost, of course, the ones who are going to incur this cost, they need to understand where this is going, how they can benefit from this. So it's a good practice to demonstrate this link between the charges that need to be paid and the benefit that these groups of people or businesses will receive. However, I should say that it's not always possible, because in many cases the revenues which are generated by carbon pricing instruments, some countries earmark all these revenues, so they show the direct link between these revenues and the climate action, but quite a big number of countries also choose to spend these revenues partly on their social economic commitments, because there's of course understanding that the governments have current needs and current commitments before the population, so additional revenue stream can be used for this purpose. There are some interesting approaches in some countries. For example, in Norway, they also allocate some portion of the revenue from carbon pricing to their sovereign wealth fund, and this is to show to the future generations that by paying now, you are helping future generations tackle climate issues, and you're basically generating funds for them so that they can solve these problems, be it mitigation, adaptation, or loss and damage, and et cetera, et cetera. So to sum up, again, you need to have a plan how you're going to utilize these revenues. You need to be very efficient in your communication, because the stakeholders, and you need to consider the perspective of all the stakeholders group. They need to understand how they're going to be benefiting from this in order to get everybody on board. So this is what I would share.
Thank you, Farid. And we move then to Emin, who is director, as I said, of Be European. Be European is SME. If I say something wrong, correct me. But Be European is a generally environmental friendly business. It is involved in a refinery of the cooked oil, yes, and producing of the raw materials, of the materials that might be used for the even biodiesel and biofuels. That's my understanding. Yeah. So the question to you is more about how you came to this idea. What was the trigger for the starting this business? I think it might be good for the audience as a motivation for that the waste management type of business or environmental friendly business might be a business. It's not just let's say cost or expenses, as generally may bring a profit. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. Our company was established 8 years ago. We've been in business for 8 years now. We are, as Gunnar said, we're recycling cooking oil. We collect cooking oil from different food establishments and also from households. And we recycle it into technical oil, and then it's being used for biodiesel production. We don't do biodiesel here. We mostly work with our European partners. We export to Europe. If I come back to your question, how it started, it all started actually after the second devaluation. We had the Manat devaluation, I think it was 9 years ago. After first devaluation, I saw the speed of reforms in Azerbaijan was speeding up, going up, and then after second one, our government introduced some tax benefits and also industrial zones. So this actually played a huge role. So at that time I was living in a different country. I decided to relocate back. And then we applied for a residency at the industrial zone. The industrial zones actually give you tax benefits. Initially we were given 7 years tax benefit, and then they actually extended it to 10 years. So basically we are a tax-free company. We're not paying tax until, so I think we have 2 years left. But we also had a lot of challenges. Obviously, it was really interesting for us because we are a relatively new country. The whole concept of waste was very, very difficult for us to communicate the message to, especially to our suppliers and also to general population. Sometimes they were making fun that, okay, it's too early for Azerbaijan. But then it actually proved to be wrong. So at the moment we are recycling huge amounts of waste oil, and we think that there's even more potential. And we also have a couple of other projects coming up. Maybe later on I can also share that.
Yeah, maybe to stop on the very important messages actually in your answer, in your response. It's you're benefiting from the tax exemption, and the tax exemption was one of the trigger or one of the reason why you thought about the business, about this business as a profitable, as a potential as a business overall. That's my takeaway. And the second is maybe you can speak more about. So generally, when we speak about just transition, it's we say that it's about the skills, it's about the potential job losses, or even if the, let's say, new economy creates new jobs, it requires new skills, and then the challenges with the suppliers, in the supply chain. And you mainly mentioned all of them. It's actually what, for example, if we touch everything separately, what type of the problems you had was the did you have a problem with the upskilling or finding the right skills for your business, and how it was accepted or by the people? Or
right. So obviously every business has its own challenges. In terms of skilled people, I'm a firm believer in recycling industry. So today I was listening to I was attending some other events. It's really nice to see investments in renewables such as solar and wind. It's really nice, but in my view, it doesn't really create the job opportunities that waste to energy can create, especially recycling industry. I believe recycling industry can create much more workplaces. And we have a huge potential. We have a really big problem with waste in this country. It is being improved, especially last couple of years. The ministry actually did a great job, especially with landfills. But there's still a lot of, I call it resource, but it's a waste, but it's a resource. And in the beginning, the challenges that we were facing, nowadays it's very easy to acquire any skill. I mean, we have YouTube. We have our lab where we do chemical experiments, and we learned everything from YouTube. So it's not really rocket science. You just mix things, maybe first few times you're going to make some mistakes, but then you learn. The most important thing is, in our industry, is communicating the message, because especially if in the future we will have carbon tax or maybe the ETS trading. You also mentioned supply chain. Supply chain is extremely important, but in waste industry, supply chain and traceability is extremely important. So we need to know where the waste is coming from and how the waste is being generated and how we can actually, especially when it comes to sorting the waste. If the waste is not sorted, then it's a huge problem. Then the cost structure actually changes a lot, because first you need to separate it and then you need to clean it. This is a huge problem that for example, our plastic recyclers in Azerbaijan, they are facing, because the waste is not being really sorted. And the solution for this is communicating the message. So private companies, they're not going to have, we don't have a lot of resources to go out and communicate the message to every single household, oh, please do this, do that. This is not going to happen. With maybe social media, we can do this, but most of the time, for example, we have an amazing team in our company. We have our vehicles driving around all the time. And the guys, we always try to communicate the message that, okay, this is how you should do it. And we're not involved in, for example, in glass or plastic, but we also communicate the message that please make sure you sort it. Sometimes people, they don't take it serious, but every year we see a change. I wasn't really expecting this, but we see a change. There are also a couple of other government initiatives. For example, we have, I might be wrong with the name of the agency, we have employment agency, Azerbaijan Employment Agency. So they have this program that if you are a manufacturing company or if you are involved in a business which is not really traditional, if I may say, they have a program where they actually called me. I didn't know we have this program. They called me and they said, we have this program. If you hire someone, they are actually covering half of the salary for 2 years. So this is a great thing. And they also have free trainings and everything depending on you. They actually organize this. Initially we thought maybe we should benefit from this, but then we thought maybe it's not really ethical because we are already benefiting from tax. And also, on top of corporate tax, there's also no income tax in Azerbaijan. Basically, there's a threshold. Up to that, there's nothing. So we thought, okay, maybe some other companies can benefit from this. I will just spread the message that, okay, if you are looking for some help with hiring people, maybe you can talk to employment agency, they can help. But it's not only the salary, it's also the trainings. They have, they offer different approach.
Thank you. And maybe last question on this step, but not last question in the session, is you said about the program of the government, but when we think about the tax, what you think, what's in your mind? You might be creative. So what's in your mind the tax authorities can do to somehow motivate the people, the supplier, to sort out the waste, for example, or something that they can do to generally to foster this transition to the low carbon economy or to decarbonization generally?
Yeah, well, I don't really think that it's only tax authorities that should deliver the message, because with all due respect, whatever they do, there's always defensive mode. That we already have a lot of tax benefits. Tax is also low in Azerbaijan. I mean, if you compare with Western world. But we had last several years, we had huge transition from cashless payments. So Ministry of Economy and State Tax Service, they are really promoting it. And I'm a big fan of this as well, because I think we should have less cash transactions. But when it comes to our industry, it's inevitable that there has to be, because we incentivize people, and especially if you go to rural places, in the beginning you need to somehow incentivize. Now we're actually doing a little experiment as a part of our expansion plan. We decided, we chose one, I haven't communicated this to many people. We have a city which is maybe 3 hours from Baku. We went there, and we were actually checking many cities just to see what's happening with the waste. And then we ended up in one of the cities. We spoke to local authorities, and then we also, we had several scenarios how we can incentivize people. We just wanted to make a little experiment to see how can we deliver the message. So long story short, we ended up with one scenario. We found a village. We were going through villages to see which one is logistically okay to do the experiment. And we ended up in one village. We're just waiting for COP29 to finish so that we can start the project. We have allocated a budget. And 10 days ago, we had a little meeting with a community in the village. We told them, look, we want to do a pilot project here. We're not expecting anything from you. And we didn't want to tell them that, okay, we're going to pay for you to sort the waste, because it will create some challenges with tax authorities. Instead, we told them we're going to build a playground here. We chose the place for a playground. And during the period of 1 month, we will give you trash bins, 2 trash bins, one for organic, another one for non-organic. We kindly ask you to sort your waste, and we will give you a playground for your kids to play. We did this because we found out that women actually take it much more serious than men when it comes to waste management. And then we said, okay, maybe this is the way we can communicate the message. They took it very serious, and starting next month, we're going to build the playground. Even if it's going to fail, I don't know what will happen, but this will help us to generate the data, because we don't have any data. We don't know what's happening with the waste. What proportion of the waste is recyclable? I have no clue. We're just checking data in Europe, but again, Europeans also tell us, look, don't really trust this data too much. because there are some issues here, there are some issues there. And we want to collect the data, we want to see how many of these households will actually take it serious, how many, and then what will be the proportion of segregated waste. And as a result, maybe we will go to authorities. Tax authorities, they are really nice because you can communicate to them all the time. Maybe they are number one agency, which is really, really open for criticism, and you can always contact them. So probably we'll go to them, but also to other government institutions to show our results and then see what kind of support we can get.
Thank you, Emin. So we slightly shifted actually from carbon taxes per se to the more other type of measures that the policymakers can do for the to promote the transition. Just before we switch to this, I just wanted to share some statistics. It's actually the World Bank indicates that what the carbon taxes, how the carbon taxes are used. The most of them are usually more than 50% are going to the total budget of the governments. It means in a pool that then is allocated to some sort of the green projects or decarbonization projects. But 10% of them, I'm saying average without linkage to the countries, but 10% out of this revenue is redistributed. What does it mean? Redistribution is generally if it's again based on some formula given back to the population, which is paying these carbon taxes, and there was the redistribution. Actually, it's was a reflection on the today's morning session with the with OECD and international organization and the researchers that what's the problem with this redistribution? There is different type of for example, it's a portion of the carbon taxes collected are going back to the population based on certain criteria. For example, based on either in the lump sum, equally to everyone, either based on their habits, if you use more, green energy and produce less carbon taxes, you receive more, and otherwise. In all of the scenarios, there are some contradictions or pros and cons, but basically there's none of them are quite fair, because in most of them, the more, for example, if we distribute based on the habits and the usage of the green, energy or production of less carbon emissions, it's as a result, the more high-income households will receive more money. It means that the government will promote this, but also penalize the low-income households for using the more carbon intensive products, let's say. But then there was, Farid, maybe ask to you about the criticism about this. So what is the alternative method? So about right now, it's I see a lot of critics about this redistribution methods, and what is the maybe other methods how we can pull back this revenue, collected carbon taxes revenue, let's say, into for the benefit of the people, for the benefit of the population. Yeah.
Thank you. Probably when answering these questions, I can refer to some knowledge and experience we hear from partners, and we hear their stories, what went well, what maybe not so well or wrong. And maybe I would also put redistribution under the umbrella of utilization of carbon tax revenues, or let's say carbon pricing revenues, because you're right. I mean, if you're going to embark on a journey and ultimately you want to see change in behavior, right? So you cannot force it, because ultimately it's up to business and consumers or households how they approach this matter. And if they don't change their behavior, then carbon tax or carbon pricing just becomes another cost item, and their life or their operation becomes more expensive. But you want really to see how they change their behavior. And the example that you've illustrated actually, I think is very useful from two perspectives. First is you want to see certain change in behavior, and for that you provide some stimulus incentives, but you also want to be analyzing how this is happening, and this is where the behavioral insight comes into play. And I should say that we and many other tax authorities actually have behavioral insights embedded in their decision-making process. So you cannot just maybe set the rules and the penalties for breaking the rules. You also want to see what forces your taxpayers or your households to act in one way or not the other. So that's why it's very useful. Again, in that example, even the public bodies or tax authorities in particular, they want to analyze the behavior of the taxpayers and what additional measures, without changing legislation or maybe toughening the penalties, you can apply to reach the goal. So when you introduce a measure of this dimension, because it affects almost everybody, and of course the major goal behind this, I think it's right, it's morally correct, and it's good for the future. In fact, it becomes essential for the future. However, during the transition period, you have to, as you mentioned, you have to consider what impact this will have on the certain groups of populations or taxpayers or businesses. And there are examples, for example, we remember when the energy bills became too expensive in certain parts of the world. For example, in Europe, some governments choose to support their households by providing one-time lump sum for the energy bills, and that was one measure, although the flip side of that action was a windfall tax on big energy companies. So ultimately this measure was funded both by private funds and public funds. However, you have to be very careful and mindful, because one thing that carbon pricing action wants to avoid is to provide excessive subsidies, and this is a very tricky point. So you have to differentiate between subsidies and stimulus measures, or even short-term or let's say limited support actions, because there's also the notion what is called net carbon rate. So it basically is the difference between the carbon price that the government sets on the taxpayers, but also the amount of subsidies that the government provides. So if the difference is negative, and this way your carbon rate becomes negative, in fact, you're not really advancing your climate agenda. You're just getting some money but spending even more, so you will not see, you're unlikely to see change in the behavior of your taxpayers. And this is, by the way, is something that is very closely monitored by the International Energy Agency or development banks, and also regulators, for example, in Europe, for example, for the purposes of CBAM program, which stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. They allow producers in their home country, the price, if the carbon price was paid in the home country, they allow for it to be offset. However, you need to be, let's say, convincing to prove that whatever you present as carbon price is actually effective carbon price, and not doing that. But having said that, of course, the amount of subsidies in fossil fuel globally, it is on the rise, and of course, this is something that COP events also talk about in great detail, that this trend seems to be negative in that perspective, that we are talking about climate action, but then the amount of subsidies increases. I think the latest figure is 7 trillion, if I'm not mistaken, which is a huge amount of subsidies. So that's why, again, the subsidies is something that the government need to be mindful of when you introduce carbon price. But to completely or immediately eliminate the subsidies is also probably unfeasible, unrealistic route, because, as we said, carbon price, in order for it to work, you really need to convince your target groups, your population, your businesses, that this is going to be a journey. There will be ups and downs, and at different stages, there will be different support measures. And of course, as you progress, the support measures would naturally decrease, because ultimately you need to reach this goal.
Thank you, Farid. Samir,
I know you're not tax expert, but you're in a position to see what the business is doing, what the governments are implementing, the measures. And maybe here some examples, if I may ask, from the business perspective as well, what they do to help, let's say, if we take the big companies, to help their suppliers to transit, what they do with the workforce. And maybe from the government perspective, if you have examples of any measures, or maybe at least the features of the measures, what is expected by the business? Thank you.
Before COP, there was obviously split opinion whether COP being an international dialogue, how much of a legacy will be left for Azerbaijan. And obviously not around the ability and learning to run huge events. I mean, that's there for sure. But in terms of the substance, we tripled in numbers the private sector joining the UN Global Compact. And the skeptics were saying it's a hype right before the COP. It's cool now to play the sustainability game. But at the same time, there are three very specific. I mean, these are the ones I know. I know there are a few more initiatives around SMEs, but three very specific reference points that I can talk about. One is the, say, ESG standards for the financial sector circulated by the central bank. Now, COP comes and goes, that's going to stay. That is in addition to the banking sector in itself viewing ESG specifically and then corporate sustainability at broad, not as a burden, but as an operational instrument to better manage their risks. Right? So as they lend, not only to look into financials, but also to assess how healthy the business is. Right? I was telling the story that, I heard it from a few banks, and then I thought, I didn't understand what that really meant, but, I realized that it clearly works to motivate the banks to join. So I, kept throwing it in a conversation, and then I felt guilty, and I did ask one of the banks to explain to me, and they did. But basically, the idea was that, however healthy a company may look financially, if they're not a fair employer, if they don't if they don't pay taxes, if they don't have employment contracts, if they pollute, chances are they're not going to last very long. So on top of the banking sector having this as an operational instrument and not a burden, now there is basically a one benchmark, which is the ESG standard circulated by the central bank. We convened the construction sector to come around and sign a very precise sustainability, decarbonization pledge. Right? Very, very, very specific items. My favorite is the cement industry, because the net zero accelerator that cement industry signed about 2 months ago, and they've just announced today at COP. Interestingly, there's no regulator. There was no regulatory pressure. We didn't have the convening role. It was really observation that we did, and provided some technical support to the content. That is an example of industry actually taking the initiative to come together. Right? And as we know, cement is a pretty aggressive industry. I mean, so for every one of the industry players to come together and work together to sign a very specific commitment, right? That is that was one of the example of the legacy that's going to stay. So speaking about the examples, I wanted to make a quick comment about the playground example. I think that is tremendous. I think that is the type of thinking that is going to help us. I mean, no one thing is going to resolve the issue, right? I mean, it's not It's not one of those things that you do big things and then it disappears. No. So we will have to be creative. We will have to sort of look into circularity on one hand. On the other hand, use say social initiatives as a stimuli. Will it work? Honestly, I think it will. Without mentioning a name or the probably the context itself will hint who that was. 20 years ago, a multinational oil company takes a small portion of their field asset security budget and invests in a community development by basically convening the community that lives along their asset, asking them what is it that you need. Some said schools, others said irrigation waters, health points. And they invest into the community from the very same budget that they've used to protect the asset from the community. Now the community is not only not a threat anymore, it is the first line of defense. Right? Because the message there is not that it comes from the company, the school comes from this particular asset. There are a few preconditions. You want to mobilize the community. It must be a community's own decision, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But these conditional sort of support, it does work. We know in the old relief days there was no condition in the support, and it only inflated the communities. But conditional support works.
Thank you, Samir. We have actually few minutes left, and before making the closure and some roundup, maybe there are some questions from the audience. Okay, if not, yeah.
Hi, Nadia Picard from PwC. I'm not a fiscal person, I have to say this up front, right? But as we're debating here a lot about how can we reduce CO2 emissions, what I do not understand is why is there a hesitation, or why should there be or not a hesitation to take income, fiscal income from carbon taxes, and on the other, put them in the general budget, but sort of through that free up some means to really put out R&D credits for hard to abate industries to really get on with their decarbonization, which is sometimes hard for them to really do out of their own means. So sort of take it away from them, and at the same time, give it back to them, but for really specific reasons that really requires them to flex their muscles a bit.
Suppose it's a question addressed to me. Thank you. I think it's a very important point, and maybe we needed to clarify this a bit. When we say redistribution, I think in very few cases this really implies giving the cash back to population directly without any conditions and asking them to exercise their judgment how they want to spend it. I think that would be a very unlikely or isolated scenario. In most cases, as you said, there has to be a purpose why redistribution happens. Different purposes for businesses, others for households. For second, of course, it's also true. How do you support these groups? Is it going to come through cash? Is it going to come through other incentives or other measures that you're going to take into account? So again, there are different approaches because we haven't implemented in Azerbaijan. It will be difficult for me to give you example again which approach worked better and what are the pros and cons. But the point you're making is very valid, that when you try to redistribute it, some countries redistribute 100% of the revenues collected through this stream. Others can have a different proportion. So that's why you really need to look at the context. I suppose in countries which are more mature in these aspects or have been going along this route for longer, you can really set aside these funds entirely and use for the purposes, some of which you have illustrated. But of course, you can also use for social economic commitments, and that's also a valid action area.
Just to add, it was not a question to me, but here just to add, we already have some sort of the incentives in the system. For example, the promotion certificate, promotion. Industry promotion certificate, yes. And there, for example, for the renewable energy sector is applicable. The questions here, not criticism, but generally the thoughts for the future. Is it enough? Yeah, and here are the thoughts for all of us, like what type of additional measures for the decarbonization of hard to abate industries might be done, or for the waste management companies that may, or for some SMEs that are doing small steps maybe towards the low carbon economy, not the huge investments into the, I don't know, construction of the wind power plant, but they start to sort out the waste, or they think about some other measures, or they upskill their workforce. That here, maybe the thoughts for us to think about how we can redistribute the income not directly to the population, but in such measures. And then one last example at the end about the successful measure in the US about the IRA, which has gives a lot of the difference criteria to they have a lot of tax credits giving to the companies investing in, for example, the green hydrogen. Yeah, but a part of that, what the interesting is in a perspective of the just transition, the tax credit that is given to the companies which are paying fair salaries, yeah, and is investing in upskilling, this goes up from 5% to 40%. Yeah, it's just because of, again, it's not about the industry, but it's about how the companies behave, what are to promote this type of the responsible actions. And there's a lot of the interest in the foreign investors that moving to the US. It's described as one of the successful measure because it's compliance burden is low, etc. Because it's the successful feature, the feature, of successful practices, tax measures, is not only the revenue that we collected, it's also it's a compliance, it's a collaboration, it's it's a consistency and predictability. And here, last question to you, Farid, maybe.
Just to add to that,
collaboration.
Maybe it will answer your question. I don't know what it will be, but within that context, so I think it's also important maybe to call it this way. So if we view decarbonization journey, and there will be different stages, and if we can call it even a decarbonization value chain, we need to look at which segment of this value chain we want to strengthen at which period. For example, the example which Günel has given already, so we have, without having carbon tax or carbon pricing in place, we already have a number of tax incentives which are available to many sectors. So if we look at decarbonization value chain, and if we assume that it starts with the intellectual property part of it, so you have to ideate, you have to come up with a solution with climate technology or whatever you may have, then, for example, even today, you can benefit from the technological parks that we have, and there are tax exemptions available in the technological parks. And by the way, they're available not only to the physical residents, but those who are registered there but operate outside of it. So again, any activity related to that software development or other IT related. So this is that part of value chain. If you move to the production and you want to scale up, then you can use industrial parks, which has mentioned already. Then you can go for investment promotion certificate. You can actually, if you're oriented for export, you can even make use of Allied-free economic zone, which requires at least 75% of your production to be export oriented. In that case, there will be unbelievable the stimulus measures available there. So again, you need to look at the whole value chain where you see yourself as a business or as an innovator. And of course, then you see where you need the extra support and you can strengthen this part or the other one.
Thank you all for the attention. And thank you to our speakers. It was a difficult topic, but I think we have managed it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.